All right. Hello, everybody. We're just getting started on our Instagram Live tonight. So we are going to start by, oh, hello. Awesome. It's great to see people already jumping on the call. We're just going to invite Dr. Jody to.
Oh, hello, everybody. Oh, so cool. Thank you all for taking the time to join us tonight. That is awesome. Ah!
You did
That
it!
is so awesome. It is so good to see you.
You too. It is always such a joy when this stuff
Oh,
works.
it is. How are you?
I'm never sure. I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. The last time we chatted, I was just saying today, I think we were like 2 weeks in to daycares and in school classes being closed and talking about all things from like leading in times of adversity to parenting through unprecedented and uncertain situations, I guess, as you will, and how we can all make it through this, sane and alive and supporting both the most vulnerable in our communities as well as our own families. So here we are.
Totally. Here we are. Smacking the outside of it. I'm so excited you asked me to join. I had a lot of people on my platform today saying like, oh my goodness, what exactly is happening? What are you going to talk to the Minister of Children's Services about? What's going to happen tonight? And I said, you know what? Here's what I love about you is that you're prepared to have hard conversations. And I think it's important because there's a lot of people, I mean, right now, this is what I've said to you all the time, is that kids are going to be okay if the people who hold them are okay.
Mm-hmm.
And we've just been through the most ridiculous time. And not many people are okay right now. What's your take on that?
You know, it's interesting. And I think just even to get into that, I was chatting with one of the moms in my.
We just jumped in, not even like, welcome everybody.
We did, but welcome
Let's
everybody. But how this idea came up, I was talking to some moms in my constituency. So as the MLA for Calgary-Shaw, reaching out, and one of the moms, Karen Henderson, from Chaparral, she's hosting a watch party. She's so excited. And we were talking about how amazing you are. And I was kind of explaining our last conversation. You know, I've got the kids running around. We're both in a similar situation and talking about all the things from our own families to exactly that. How do you support the people who hold them at a time when all of our regular community centers are closed, in-person classes were closed, the regular support systems for kids just weren't happening? And we were talking about our favorite Dr. Jody quotes. Dr. Jody, and I call you that. Is that okay? I don't call you Dr. Carrington. I don't call you Jody. I was just call you Dr. Jody. Is that okay?
Do you want me to call you Minister Schulz or Rebecca?
No,
Because I feel like right now, if we're going to talk about hard things, man, we got to go first names only.
okay, that's good. But I mean, you've worked hard for a PhD, so I gotta still, Dr. Jody it is. But I can't help it. I'm just used to it, but you can call me Rebecca. And so we were just talking about our favorite Dr. Jody quotes, and mine, I always think of the flip lid. And I also think about kindness and grace. And I'm not going to cry on today's Instagram, but the first time I heard you say that we need to give each other kindness and grace because we're all just walking each other home, there is nothing more beautiful than that, because through a time like this, I think, and my approach has always kind of been to hear the honest feedback. Going to make difficult decisions, but have the difficult conversations that we need to have to make things better. I've always been committed to that, and I think if we are giving each other a bit of grace and having faith in that process, then we get to a better place. And so that's one of my favorite Jody quotes, is that we're all just walking each other home. And certainly that's true with our own kiddos in our own communities, but also in children's services. And now I do have to say, though, that you've worked with children's services in the past. I want to just talk a little bit for all of you who are just tuning in and are like, who's Dr. Jody? I mean, most of you are here probably for Dr. Jody. Let's be serious, but the brilliant and hilarious Dr. Jody, public speaker, author of this book, Don't Judge the State of This Book, Kids These Days. It's awesome. I'm on my second pass, but I spent a lot of time driving back and forth and had to go get this from my car. And I am on my second pass, so sorry it's in rough shape, but it's an amazing book. PhD in clinical psychology, mom of 3. You just received an award too. I had to go back and dig for it because I saw it on your Insta stories. Red Deer and District Community Foundation Women of Excellence Awards. Nothing makes me more proud than women doing amazing things in their communities and in our province. And I will also just go ahead and call you the pride of Olds, Alberta. That's true.
I know. You know? Come on.
Oh, you're so awesome.
Yes.
So
thank you so much for all of that. I mean, I that's so great to be on your platform tonight. I really am honored.
So jumping right in, like we've had a ton of questions from parents who are like, how do we do all of this? You know, how do we know kids are going to be okay? So the 2 questions that kind of came in, and you know, they're kind of different levels of intensity maybe for you, is how do we know the difference between stress and the regular stress that families are going through right now, and trauma and things that are going to last, you know, well beyond the time of COVID. And I think that that's something that lots of parents and families are wondering, especially as we navigate all of the things, like how do we make sure that our kids know, and I've talked about this with Dr. Hinshaw, how do you make sure that kids know, here's what's going on, here's why things are different, but not create fear, and also not let the stress of this uncertain time have a long-lasting negative impact, that we can still come through this positive. And I mean, now we're in the relaunch, so I guess, you know, this is a good time to talk about that. But what are your thoughts on that? Stress versus trauma, and coming out and still keeping ourselves and our neighbors safe and being careful, but being positive about what's to come.
I think, you know, a couple of things come to my mind, which I think is really important about this process, is that we really want to jump back in and be positive and make kids be okay, and say things like kids are resilient and they're going to be okay. And all of those things are true. But what I think we forget about often is really just sitting in the emotion of it all. Because this was hard. This was hard for parents. I mean, this still is hard. I mean, when we just talk about like loss of life and income and structure and routine and predictability, embedded in all of those things is the potential for trauma. Because how we identify trauma is any experience encoded in terror, right? So when big people aren't okay, kids likely won't be okay too. Now, the truth of this is, there's been so much uncertainty about what's happening next. Is mom okay? Is dad okay? Is grandma and grandpa going to be okay? What's going on financially? Are things safe for me? And when we're in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, we don't feel a lot of things. And now, I mean, you know my love of educators, and I spend a lot of time speaking to people who hold these babies, because they've been in a state like many of us, just kind of holding our breath, feeling exhausted, out of routine, out of predictability. And now I think, Rebecca, more than any time is when we're going to start to feel it. How do we start to hold space and start to be like, okay, just a second, before we jump back in and say, you know, we're going to be okay. How do we go, okay, what in the name of all that is holy just happened here? And what are the ramifications? And for me, I think my biggest concern is now, and probably 6 months from now. And as I talk about, you know, in education and daycare centers and all of those things that we talk about, is how do we hold space? How do we make sure that we can say these 3 words all the time? Tell me more. And you and I've talked a little bit about this, you know, just at the beginning of COVID, is like, how do we ask these hard questions like, what am I missing, mama? What am I missing? Tell me more, right? Because what we try so hard to do is fix emotional dysregulation and fear and sadness, you know? Even when, you know, the couple of times we talked, it was a little bit like, I don't know. What do we do about this? And I'm so worried about this. And should I just jump on and say to these vulnerable babies, like, no. How do we say, what am I missing? Tell me more, right? Because I think we are so inclined to fix. And you know this, I mean, as a psychologist, as a minister, we're put into positions where we want to have the answers for things. And what we often miss is, how do we hold space for this stuff? Because we have just been through something that none of us have a script for, right? Can we handle it? Oh, we're wired to do hard things. People who've come before us have handled, that's not a question for me, right? It is how we do it that matters. So how do we hold space? How do we say, you know, to the people who hold, like our daycare workers and our teachers and our, you know, our educators and our foster parents and our group home providers, I see you. I see you, and I'm so grateful. How's your heart? What was the hardest part? What are you worried about the most, right? And when we don't have a space to sort of say, I don't know where this kid is, I'm worried about this. I mean, this kid is now, his physical needs have been met, but now, what's the trauma? And that's the question that comes to me so often, right? Are kids going to be traumatized as a result of this? Two things. Where does that question come from? Because we're scared. We want our babies to be okay. We want to know that even in this time when we've been upset and there's been no predictability, routine, all those things, the most important question that we're asking right now is, are the kids going to be okay? The answer to that all the time for me is, are you okay? What do you need? Tell me more, right? These babies can handle hard things as long as the big people who've got them are going to be okay. I mean, we've watched kids go through multiple generations of abuse, neglect, and trauma. And the reparative experience of that is really who can hold space for. How do we say, Dan Siegel talks about this all the time, name it to tame it. Right? Name it to tame it. When we say, you're fine, we're fine. You're fine? I work with first responders all the time. You know that, right?
Yeah.
And it's rich with a culture of, you're good? We're good. We're good. And that is where the system falls apart, is where we don't name it to tame it. This is friggin' hard. And I know I'm not supposed to swear, so I'm going to be very careful. This is friggin' hard. Are you proud of me? Did you notice that? Tell your PR team, watch me. I'm doing this for you. It's friggin', it doesn't have the same feel, you know, it's hard versus this is friggin' hard. But for the sake of the Alberta government, I will say this is friggin' hard. But I'm so grateful that we can have these conversations, because I think that's the point, is that we often try to sort of fix and say, here's what you need, here's what you need, here's what you need. I want to make sure we know where those needs are, that we hear it, right? And I think, you know, I love how you listen. I love how we're into that state of like, tell me what's the hardest part, because when you hold the emotion, oftentimes there isn't huge answers for this. Oftentimes it isn't like, okay, you're going to fix this. This is what's going to fix this right now. Here's what's going to, because it fixes it for one person, but it drops it for others. And what we miss in this moment is, how do we hang on to say, this has been so difficult, particularly for our vulnerable families, for our babies who, you know, didn't have structure, routine, predictability to begin with. Okay. All hands on deck. Right? Does that make sense?
And that is, and I remember our conversation, you know, one of my first questions is, what do I need to do? How do I make sure that the vulnerable kids, you know, in this province, because we know, and I've shared this publicly, that we had fewer calls coming in. And part of that was because community centers were not up and running, in-person classes were not happening. So we had fewer calls into the ministry, fewer assessments to do in terms of the abuse, neglect, and maltreatment of vulnerable kids. And when you said to me, you don't have to have all the answers, you need to reach out to the people who hold the kids. And so I just started picking up the phone. I called our child advocacy centers. I called all of our prevention and early intervention supports. I mean, that's difficult because we are right in the middle of a transition where we had a previous model and we're moving to a new model. And that's obviously disruptive because that was supposed to happen on April 1st. But you know what? When I started picking up the phone and calling all of these people, you know, our community organizations are doing amazing work on the ground. And, you know, some of the feedback I got was, we have learned more in terms of how to be innovative in the last couple of weeks than we've been able to, you know, over the last how long. And it's just, everybody works together and pitches in. Somebody saying, what new model? Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the comments. And that's where we had, since kind of the mid-90s, we had overlapping programs for community resource, family resource, and parent link centers. And we brought them together into a interconnected network of supports for families, kids 0 to 18, recognizing that there were some gaps in the previous service model. And this was feedback we got from the sector, from different community organizations who said, we got to be more connected, because kids and family don't just build relationships and then move on to the next one and say, okay, that's great, my kid is 7, so now I'm just going to go over here now and build all new relationships. So as we transition into that, I just picked up the phone and said, what are you doing? What do you need from me? And truly watching our community groups come together. I know the Alberta Foster and Kinship Care Association was sharing some of this today, jumped onto one of their calls. Again, just amazing ways of supporting each other and communities to come together to say, you know what, I'm having that struggle too. And I think to your point is that we're still having those discussions and being okay to have those discussions, and people saying, you know what, I don't have all the answers, but what are you doing over there? How can we do better to support kids and families? How do we continue to reach out? And we heard the same thing from childcare operators in preschools. And some people were nervous to open. Some people were ready to go right away. Some were not confident or comfortable opening up for essential service workers. And that's okay, right? And that was where, you know, Dr. Jody, I used your comments the one day on one of our teletown halls. I said, we just need to have kindness and grace, as Dr. Jody says, that everybody's situation and everybody's comfort level with all of this is going to be different. And that's okay.
Right. I think that's the biggest thing. And I think that sometimes, you know, I gotta tell the story when we were on the phone together, right at the beginning of the COVID, right? And let's read the comments.
I know what you're gonna I know what you're gonna say.
Okay. Can I say it? I'm gonna say it. So here's the thing. I mean, you as a mom, me as a mom, right? Like we say a lot of things about okay, here's what I'd love to happen. Here's what I hope to happen. Here's what, oh my gosh, my heart is in this place for kids and families. Like I think oftentimes convincing people that is the truth is the hardest thing on the planet. And, you know, when we were speaking about our own babies, you're like, oh my gosh. I said, what happened? She's like, oh, my daughter just bit my bum. I was like, yeah, she did. That's the stuff that happened. And I was like, tonight before I got on the phone call, my son, we had a nest in the back and we found an egg that died, and I put it in the compost. I lied and I said that it was at the chicken coop at the farm and we were going to hatch it. And this is the stuff in the moment where he said to me, you lied to me. You said we could do hard things. You said we could do hard things and you didn't think we could do hard things. Do you know what you did? You killed my dream. Not only did you kill the bird, you killed the dream.
Oh.
Sweet Jesus. I mean, listen, you're the Minister of Children's Services. I'm a child psychologist. At the heart of this, what matters the most is when emotion is huge, how do we hold space for it? How do we get into this and be like, okay, there's so many times we're like in the middle of it, trying to wonder what's happening? What do we do? How do we do this? And I think the issue is when you hold space for this emotion, that's the half of it. I can see in your, in the comments, right? People are saying, what about those of us holding kids, right? What about the funding for programs with our most vulnerable kids, right? And I think those are all such great questions. And the deal is, it's so much about this. How do we figure out exactly what's going to be the best course of action in this place? And I know from my perspective, it is, are we looking after the people who hold them, right? Are we looking after the people who hold them so that they can stand up and serve? If you're okay, you lead beautifully. If I'm okay, I do so much better. Will there be moments and times where we're not okay? Yeah. And how do we set into this place where, tell me more. Tell me more. What am I missing? What do I need to know more about? And then if there was a magic wand, that'd be beautiful, that we would do everything that we could do in this moment. But I think the hearing of it matters in the mess of it all, when there's no clear path. What do you think about that?
And I think that's exactly it, is that we have to have those discussions and we have to answer the what else are we missing? And that's one of the things that when we, you know, in some of the conversations I've had, I always hold a pen, so I'm going to put it down so I'm not pointing it. One of, like, a lot of what I have been trying to do is say, like, don't think of, you know, what's current, like, what are the other things that we need to address? And so those, I think, some of the feedback we've gotten is that those aren't questions that people are typically asked for. Like, we think about, you know, what has a minister typically done, or, you know, this is what's typically the case. But, you know, for me, it was just, where can I show up? Where can I listen? Where can I hear the feedback? And making sure people know that I'm here to do that at any time in any way. And including things like this. And I mean, that's it, the people who are in, whether it's childcare centers or if it is parents or it's foster care givers or kinship caregivers or those working for frontline community groups supporting vulnerable kids and families, the questions are often then around, okay, this is really stressful. So how do we know that, like, how do we really make sure that even when we're feeling nervous, we can still support our kids? And one of the questions that came in, I mean, it came in 2 times, and you've already touched on it tonight, is show up and be there and do it consistently. So how do you do that when your mind is in a bazillion different places? And I mean, you know, the example in it for me was, you know, I FaceTime my kids because I am in Edmonton from Monday to Thursday, and I FaceTime and it's like, hey mom, did you know that, what did he say today? Like, orcas are predators and they eat squids. And then the phone, you're staring at the ceiling, you know, but you still want to show connection. You know, same things. Parents are stressed. Or, you know, I talked this morning with a friend who's a teacher and has 2 young kids at home. And she said, my mind is always going in 27 different directions. How do I make sure? And she's also a huge fan. So that, I think, was why the conversation turned to that this morning. But then how do we make sure that at this time where we're worried about a lot of different things and going back and forth between, you know, just doing the day-to-day and worrying about COVID-19 and then focusing on the relaunch and getting things back to normal, how do you make sure that you're doing that, that you're showing up, that you're consistent?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a great question. And I think from my perspective, you know, I often say this as a psychologist, you know, we're wired to do hard things. And how we know this to be true is that there's been people before us who have done remarkably hard things. And I get a lot of questions about, you know, will kids survive this when we are, you know, having to stay disconnected from them, when we're in the middle of the COVID. You know, a lot of times kids have been in 2 different homes, right? Can't go back and forth between mom and dad, or mom's a healthcare worker, or, you know, we can't go on visits. How is this going to affect them? And what I think is most critically important to remember in this process is that at the heart of all of this is emotional regulation. You can't tell kids how to do hard things, you have to show them. And there has been many people who have survived hard things before us, and we got to look, how did that happen? Nelson Mandela was in isolation for 24 years. Viktor Frankl, right, is in Auschwitz, watches his children die, watches his parents die, separated from his spouse, she's killed. He comes out of this and writes one of the greatest literary works of all time called Man's Search for Meaning. And in this process, he says, I needed to believe there was a purpose to this. I needed to believe that I was wired to do hard things. But I also knew to the core of me that I was wired for connection. And sometimes, you know, I often talked about this with foster parents, or, you know, we get separated from the kids that, you know, we've loved for a long time. How do we stay connected in those times? What matters to me most is that they know they matter. To the best of our capacity, right? If there's restrictions around visiting, connection, all those things. I mean, I mean, many times when kids have been in care, when I've been lucky enough to work with those families, they're like, how do we stay connected in this process? And it's like, I want you to know, and I want them to know that even if you're physically apart, that you can stay connected to each other, right? And I think that happens by all kinds of ways, like transitional objects. That happens by ways like FaceTime. That happens by ways, I mean, dads are deployed to Afghanistan for 6 months at a time, 12 months at a time, right? How do I stay connected to that relationship? And oftentimes those relationships can be as healthy as a parent who is in much more frequent contact. It is the story that the babies have in their heads, and that we can then have those conversations. What's the hardest part? Tell me what you're worried about the most. How do we hold space for kids and families in that way? How do they hold space for the vulnerable babies? And I think those are the questions that we don't often, you know, talk the most about. But in my office, that's what we talk a lot about, right? And I know the purpose of tonight's call was really to talk about how do we parent through these hard things? How do we open up space and talk a little bit about how do we walk our kids through a time like this? Well, how do we walk through vulnerable people at a time like this? And for me, I think, I mean, long before COVID hit, this question came up lots of times before. How do we do this? And if I'm talking about how we serve kids in our communities, well, if we're a daycare worker or a foster parent, so much of this comes back to the fact that we can't tell them, we got to show them. And when they get upset and get worried, what we often try to do is tell them, it's okay, calm down, relax. And you can't tell somebody how to do it, you got to show them. right? I often tell the story. I've told it a number of times over the last three weeks. Is it okay if I keep telling you the story? I don't mean to cut you off.
Totally. You're good.
I do that a lot. Okay, so Glennon Doyle has written a book called Untamed, which is a very fascinating read. She talks a lot. She tells a story in this book around when she was going through a divorce and she felt like she was just messing her kids up, and she felt so awful about how distraught they were and how she wasn't serving them well. And she calls her good friend Liz Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, Big Magic, has all these beautiful things, okay? And she said, Liz doesn't have kids. And she said, I'm messing them up. I have made this decision to leave their father. What if I'm wrecking them? Oh my goodness. And I think Liz gave the most profound answer that I think about all the time, which is this. She said, in any chapter of life, there's going to be significant turbulence, right? When you get on a plane, there's always turbulence. Yet, whether it's just at the beginning or just at the end, there's always some kind of turbulence. We are in a particular flight right now where there is significant turbulence, right? Nobody has a plan. We're wondering about funding. There's tons of emotion in our province, in our country, on the globe around Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter. We're talking about some major national incidents of tragedy that have all been messed together in this last 6 months. That is ripe for emotional dysregulation, right? That's huge. Yeah. And if Liz said this to Glennon, if you look to the flight attendant when there is significant turbulence on a plane, like you've dropped 50, right? What happens when she says, or the flight attendant says, "Holy damn it!" Everybody on the plane panics, right? Don't they? I mean, they're pulling out the rosaries. People are calling. They're not listening. They're because there's tons of emotion. And as a parent, as a foster parent, as a caregiver, so much of this in the moment is like, how do we keep serving the peanuts? In the moment, how do we walk our kids home through this process? One sweet step at a time, right? We are wired to do hard things. We are only able to do those hard things when we remember this. We're wired for connection. And
well,
I think that,
oh yeah. Well, I was going to say, you can go ahead. I don't want to interrupt, but I did I'm sorry. I looked down and I'm reading some of the comments, and I do want to answer some of them. And also, I have someone from my office kind of writing them down because they go kind of fast and I can't read them as fast as you're all typing. But I think that's one thing that, we are, I see lots of questions about whether it's schools reopening and what the plans are going to be, or even, as far as childcare, we've had 6 teletown halls with childcare providers, operators, preschools, just to talk through what the process is as we go through it. I know that the Minister of Education worked with stakeholders across the board, right, to hear from boards and from teachers and other partners to say, what do you need? And I recognize that right now we're looking to have 3 potential options for back to school. But that's also recognizing that we also rely on Dr. Hinshaw and her good advice and what happens over the next 2 months. And I do recognize that uncertainty, it does create some anxiety. It's no different than some of the parents that we chat with that say, we don't know whether or not to send our kids back to daycare. And we have childcare frontline educators or operators saying, I don't know whether or not we want to open right away, and some did and some didn't. And so that's where I think asking those questions, reaching out, trying to navigate through some of that uncertainty, different people are going to have different responses, and that's okay too. And, and as we come to plans, I know so many of you are asking about, we need to make sure that we have a plan for getting back to school. And there will be, I know, August 1st, I can kind of read some people saying, that's not strong enough of a plan, but it's also an uncertain time. And there are 3 different options. And, I think it's important that the minister is working with school divisions to say, okay, what would these 3 different scenarios look like? How can we take the data and the feedback and guidance of Dr. Hinshaw? And I truly believe we're so blessed to have her as the Chief Medical Officer of Health at a time like this, and her calm approach and good advice very grateful, I think, for that, because that became something too that was consistent for people across Alberta, to hear from both Dr. Hinshaw and also government in terms of what the path forward is going to look like. So, I think it's too, being as transparent as we possibly can and sharing the information that we have when we have it. And certainly that was the position I was in, where, we didn't necessarily know what things were going to look like, but still having the calls and reaching out to people, and taking the questions, even, when we were still having those discussions, with the chief medical officer of health to say, what is this going to look like? But I think hearing something was really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so much of it. And I'm kind of reading the question too a little bit about, like, what is the plan? And I love that question, right? Like, so listen. Yesterday, as you know, was National Indigenous Peoples Day. And we had this beautiful conversation about, okay, so we need a seat at the table, but we need a voice. So there's something very different about listening, right? Holding space. And then what do we do with that, right? That becomes the question, right? Then what is the action? And I bet you get asked this question all the time. Okay, so now that we listen and we hear the voices, then what? How do we represent that on the ground? I mean, you must get that all the time.
We do. And so specifically, I hear that both as an MLA on lots of issues. So we're sitting right now. So I'm in Edmonton Monday to Thursday, but I still make calls to my constituents. I still take emails, calls, whatever works best for people. But even too, before we listened on childcare, for example, is probably a good example. On one of our calls, we were asked, redirect the funding, wage subsidies, top ups. We've invested like $30 million additional dollars in the last year to address subsidy, redirecting, making sure that the parents and families who need it most. And I think now more than ever, it's hugely important, in terms of getting Alberta parents back to work and making sure that they have access to high quality, affordable, accessible childcare, for those who need it. I see questions about $25 a day. I'm not even wearing my glasses and I can see that. So I'm going to try to answer that as well, because I know it's come up twice, but we're continuing to fund those exact things and respond to what the sector has asked for. And certainly we reached out and decided that we still have to work with the federal government on what our child care bilateral agreement works is going to look like. And I know that takes time. But we've continued to still have town halls throughout that process so that people know, here's where we're at, here's what we're thinking. We are in the middle of gathering feedback before we make decisions. In childcare, we've committed 3 different phases of funding to support operators. And so right now, that's exactly what we're doing, is listening. Where are the gaps? What haven't you been covered by? Where are the gaps left by federal and provincial and municipal programs? What does that look like? And how can we, it's also not a surprise or a secret that we are also not only in this major health pandemic, but we are in the biggest economic downturn that we've seen in nearly a century. So how can we be creative, out of the box ideas? And I'm grateful for the people who just call me up and say, I don't know if this is something that's doable, but those are the best conversations I think we can have, is how do we get creative about this? But also knowing that, I'm a working mom. My kids are 5 and 2. I absolutely value high quality childcare. And I know that it's hugely important. And then also, as we've already spoken, before I moved to the child intervention side, kind of as we've already spoken about, but people are asking about $25 a day daycare. I will say, that program, I've been clear certainly over the last year that we're going to continue to work with the federal government on that. That helped 2% of Alberta families, and I understand it was a pilot, but right now we know what we have in terms of resources, and I truly believe that we've got to continue to support the most vulnerable parents and kids in our province, no question. I am absolutely committed to that, and I am also very grateful. We have exceptional childcare operators across this province who are passionate, and they show up every day to support kids and families, even at this uncertain time. And frontline educators are amazing. Where's the 2% from? That's because the pilot only addressed 122 centers across childcare centers across the province of about 2,800. And so that's what we're working on with the federal government. And then when it comes to child intervention and prevention, early intervention, hugely important. We know that, as you said, Dr. Jody, we don't necessarily see the impact of what's happening right now. And that's one of the things in terms of assessments or calls coming into the child abuse hotline have gone down. When I spoke to the child advocacy centers, they're seeing similar things. But, you know, they're all ready to support those families. And I think that that's hugely encouraging, and it's also so very necessary as we move forward. And many of our family resource centers are already, they're making those connections. They're getting up and running. They're reaching out digitally. They're having socially distant meetups in the parks to make sure that families have a place to go to just get out and connect with each other. That's amazing.
Yeah, I am so wildly impressed by that too. What I wonder about, is there any word on extending the pilot? Like, is that an opportunity? Like, was it successful? Like, in sort of what you understand to be true?
Some pieces were, absolutely. And so right now, if we wanted to extend $25 a day daycare across the province, we did here. It's inequitable. It didn't measure need or employment or means or anything like that, and it would cost over $1 billion. So well over double our current budget for childcare. And when I came into this role, child intervention wasn't even adequately funded. So for me, I had to fund child intervention, increase that funding, pay off what wasn't funded previously, and then account for that now. Ultimately, though, we want to keep more kids supported to stay at home with their families, which the Wellbeing and Resiliency Framework, which I've talked about a lot, it was released under the former government. It's exceptional work. It's built on brain science and the most current research that we have on supporting kids and their brain development. And so the family resource networks and our prevention and early intervention work is moving to implement that Wellbeing and Resiliency Framework. And I am so excited, really, based on what I've heard already about that transition getting up and running. I can't wait to get out there and see what these centers can do for families now, both adhering to the Wellbeing and Resiliency Framework, but in this interconnected way that makes sure that families have all the supports they need. And no matter if you're in, you know, rural, remote Northern Alberta, or you're in Calgary or Edmonton, the quality of the supports that you're getting are going to be the same.
Right. Got it. And I mean, I guess for me, I struggle so significantly about how hard this must be to be in a place where, how do you decide where to put stuff when there's limited resources? Like, I'm in the middle of this, we are so struggling to make sure everybody is okay, and figuring this process out. I mean, it's got to be.
But you know, my budget.
Difficult.
My budget actually increased.
Like, I watched you try to explain this, and I'm like, oh. Like, I am losing my breath, because I'm like, how do you, like, oh, this one, and then we talk about this one, and then we talk about this one, and we know so much about how critical it is right now to hold that emotion, so that down the road, right, the prevention, the intervention at this point becomes so critically important. Like, bust your soul kind of work when you're on the ground, right? And as you're watching all of this happen around you, my gosh.
Well, and I think too, like, it's important to point out, my budget was not reduced. My budget will increase over the next, I guess 3 years. And that was the projection, but there's still always ways that we can do things better. And that's where all of our changes in prevention and early intervention, this was feedback we heard very early on. Last summer, I got out right away. We did a tour all across the province, and this was feedback that we heard from people who were already, these community organizations that were already doing this work. And they said, look, you know, we were investing money in system navigators, or, you know, community newsletters that had they've just been happening since, I think some of them went back to 1995, but that's not how parents communicate anymore. It's not how people get their primary information, but it also, there were significant gaps within the system. That, do we universally support all kids, all things 0 to 6, or do we focus our supports on really reducing the number of kids coming into care? Because that was one of the things we've invested in, prevention and early intervention, again, over the last 20 years, but the number of kids coming into care as a percentage of a population wasn't going down. And we know that if we can support families and keep kids connected with their families, with their communities, specifically with their culture, that's going to be better in the long run. So we had to do something differently. The Wellbeing and Resiliency Framework, and I have said before, that was introduced in February of 2019, I believe, the former government, but it's excellent work. And we had to continue down that path. And so, you know, I can't wait to see it getting up and running. I mean, it is already, it's just things aren't quite back to normal with all of the public health guidelines, but they're finding a way to still reach out and support the most vulnerable kids in our community. And the feedback of those actually in the community supporting the most vulnerable has been so important in transforming that work.
I love that. I love that. And you know what I think is so really critically important is, you know, when we've talked a little bit about this before, when kids have a trauma history, when there is a significant, you know, issue that sort of goes on, it's like the village that supports them that becomes so critical. And, you know, we're talking about parenting through a pandemic, when we're doing all of these kind of things, it's like the village, the funders. And I see, you know, your constituents or your, you know, your followers say this quite often, right? How do we look after the people, not just in the kinship care homes, but I mean, it often is the EAs and the funding and early intervention, the village that holds these babies, right? The child care workers, right? So when we invest in, you know, the parenting capacity of it, that's fantastic. But the village building becomes the most critical piece, right? And I often say this as a child psychologist, it's the baby that's not my concern, it's the people who hold them, right? Yeah. And that is the system. I love when you say that. In the next 3 years, right, we're listening now. And what you keep hearing, what I hear you saying, right, is this idea that it is about holding space for the people that hold them, giving not just a seat at the table to the people who understand what it's like to be in their culture or to be in their schools or to be in, you know, the trauma-informed practices. But here's the voice. So they've said it, and here's what we know to be true, is it's the people who support them that matters.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, do you know what I mean about the village is the piece that matters the most about that, right? And I remember the first time we sat down, I said, you know, what I'm so concerned about sometimes is when I would go on a child welfare call, or when I, you know, was interested in sort of assessing a babe in a home, it's like frontline workers, social workers who hold on to these babies, do apprehensions, do all of those things, right? If they're not okay, if they're coming in and not able to serve the peanuts, you know, in that story that I just said, then that apprehension's not going to go well. Then holding it, then when that baby shows up at school and needs an EA, right? It's that village that becomes so critically important. And I mean, I know you're one cog in the wheel, which becomes so difficult sometimes to be able to affect change. But we've had some of these hard conversations, and I think it's important, right, to understand from this perspective, this government's perspective, about what does trauma-informed care look like, right? Because honest to gosh, nobody's ever asked that question for a very long time about what does that look like from a comprehensive way? How do we relationship focus, not necessarily about the vulnerable babies, but the people who hold them? I think that's the important thing that I would love to see implemented as we get back, you know?
Well, and I think the other thing that we're doing a little bit differently, like last week we met with an organization that had a COVID-related crisis around mental health. And so when our stakeholders came in, when this community group came in, they met with myself, they met with Minister Luan, Minister LaGrange, the Minister of Education, Minister Ahir, Minister Chandro, all of us in one room saying, okay, we are very much committed to looking at this as a government. And so that's often what then is surprising to people. Hey, wait, because oftentimes we hear government works in silos, and we're very much committed to solving these problems across the board, because we need mental health and addictions, health, education, community and social services, education, status of women, and culture and multiculturalism, all hugely important, justice. And so we've been building that into the work that we do. And I think we see that working. I mean, when I look at the Child Advocacy Center model, you know, we have justice, health, children's services coming together to say, how do we support you? And that's really a model where communities created that model of how do we support kids who have been through things that most others find, couldn't even imagine, right? And so it's so important, but my colleagues are so committed to that. And it makes, it's not as simple division making, but the results are better.
Oh, like astronomically. And I think that's oftentimes, what is so significantly important is how silos are so critical. I mean, we've talked about this in education, we've talked about this in childcare, we've talked about this in many different places where we get siloed and we start to work again and again and again on one individual piece, and we reinvent the wheel 3,000 times versus having more conversation. And I think if there's anything that's going to be so helpful as, you figure out limited resources and where do they go, I love to hear that, Rebecca. I love to hear that Minister of Education and Children's Services, they must be like this, because that is so critical in this process of the village, right? Yeah. When I leave you with an EA, an educator, and a PUF funder, and we have all of these things, and we go into a foster home, and then we want to facilitate relationships with kinship care and biological family and culture, right? All of that together is so critically important. Is that a new thing, do you think? Like, I mean, I know that this is not an old position for you, but do you think historically the silos have been much more there than they would be now?
I mean, that's what some of our community partners have heard when we sit down and we meet together. Okay. I think of just touring different facilities and coming together. People have said that this is a very different approach. And so I'm encouraged by that, because we need to work together to make the best decisions we can, not only for the vulnerable in our province, but also our youngest citizens, and supporting our families. And I think it does make it interesting, because I recognize why government is structured the way it is, and we have to be responsible for the tax dollars that we invest, and that's hugely important. But then we also just have to work together, because it's not as simple as saying, okay, this is children's services, this is education. And children's services typically isn't all things children. It's specifically targeted child intervention, prevention and early intervention, as well as childcare. Okay. But there's lots of other places, lots of other ministries that support communities and families.
Right. Yeah. And I love that in so many ways. It's like how, I've talked to Minister LaGrange about this once as well. When there's no universal approach to mental health treatment, in our education system, it becomes much more competitive than it does be collaborative, right? And we have resources across all of our school divisions. And how do we do this in a way that says, this kid's CUME file is this big, right? He's also been in care for 3 years. How do we collaborate and put those resources together and support that system? Because there's all of these babies across many of our different divisions that often end up going across borders, going in and out of care, how do we make sure that, the system speaks the same language around trauma-informed, relationship-focused care? And as we step out of this time of really uncertainty, big emotion, the biggest issue across ministries is if we can start saying regulation of emotion has to happen first with the people who hold them. And then and only then will these babies be able to make sense of hard things. Right? Does that make sense? And I'm so thrilled to hear that the cross ministries work is a big focus for you, because that is, for me, the most important thing.
Absolutely. And we, even when I think after we spoke and we were talking about how are we going to be able to connect with vulnerable kids and families, that was my colleagues and I, we were in my office actually that day saying, how do we do this? How do we reach out? How do we connect? And we know for all of you who are educators out there, you may have received our ask, which was, you're still providing classes, you're still reaching out, your students so very well. If you see anything that you're worried about, please reach out, right? Because we know how important those community services are, and teachers, educators, kids. And so that was where that generated from, for example, and then continuing to reach out together when we have, obviously, some of our community partners are funded by more than one ministry. And so we took some of those calls together to say, what can we do? Are you receiving what you need? Making sure that their questions were answered. We had Dr. Hinshaw doing teletown halls for our community organizations with myself and the Minister of Community and Social Services, Minister Sani, to say, how can we help you? Are you getting what you need? Have you gotten your PPE? Is your order in? All of those things. And so we'll continue to work on that. And for all of you who've asked questions that we didn't quite get to, I promise you, I'm going to do my best throughout the week to start answering some of those questions. Specifically, this is what we do. You know, anytime you have questions, you please reach out to me. Dr. Jody, there's one other question that came in a couple of times before this started that I think we kind of might have answered, but maybe not fully. So when we're trying to work from home and we're all having that same challenge, what are some tips or tricks for us, those who hold our kids, who are there to support our kids, when we're mentally everywhere else, but we're physically present?
And do you think that question comes from somebody serving kids or their own babies?
I don't know where that came from. It just came in via email earlier today.
I love it. So I think this is the biggest, that is just the quintessential question, right? Is that like we get so caught up in how we're not serving kids well, and we start to get in the fight about, you know, what do we do? Oh, we're not doing enough, right? It is that fundamental need in so many ways to be able to hold space for that emotion and drop those shoulders. I mean, even as we're having this conversation tonight, right? And, you know, we read comments and we're like, oh, shit.
Did you see?
I was going to say shit there. I was going to say that, but I didn't. So shoot.
But you did.
But I see how yeah, stop. You missed it. Okay. But I think so much what happens is this goes on, right? This is true of parents, right? When we get more overwhelmed with things, when things start to happen, so much of it is, how do we, the body keeps the score. Trauma lives in our bodies. And when we get really triggered and really invested in things, we lose our capacity to speak well, to advocate well, to be able to stay connected well. And I think that's the number one piece is there's so much emotion. How do we sit in the space, drop our shoulders, and go back in again, right? This isn't like, how do we say, you know what, this is not where this is too much, I'm not doing it. How do I feel it, right? The first thing is, I mean, we talked about this tonight already, holding space. Then once I hold space and feel all of that big emotion, I got to really check in with me, right? As a mom, as an educator, as a daycare provider who's, you know, trying to still stay connected with my kids on Google Meets and FaceTimes. As an educator, I say this all the time. Do you know what you've just done for kids and families? If you serve in the capacity of looking after kids and families right now, I mean, this has been remarkably difficult. And where's the grace for you? Where's the grace for you, mama? Where's the grace for you, daycare provider, foster parent? We're only going to be okay if you're okay. So how do we do that in the moment and understand so significantly about this process, right? Is that we can't stop kids from learning. We can't stop kids from getting the literacy and the numeracy. What matters so much right now is we walk them home. And that was actually a Ram Dass quote that you started with today. We're all just here walking each other home. And I think in some of, you know, our ministries where they serve kids and families, it becomes, I think, some of the holiest work on the planet, because we have to look after the people who hold them. When we're okay, when we can remind parents. I mean, as a child psychologist, I say this all the time. I rarely treat kids. The biggest focus of my practice is always on parents, caregivers, the people who hold them, right? I'm a child psychologist. I don't even like to speak to kids. I want to hang on to the educators, right? I want to talk to the daycare providers and remind them, if you are sitting on an Instagram Live on a Tuesday night, is it Tuesday?
Monday? Is it Tuesday? It's Monday.
On a Monday night, thank you very much. It doesn't matter. And you are this invested in doing the work that you do for kids and families. If you are own a baby who is struggling, you are so, this is all here because you're so invested so deeply in this process. And I love that. How do we do that to stay in the game for the kids that we are parenting and bringing up and showing them how to do it, how we serve our communities, our education systems, we do all those things. How do we afford ourselves to find a little bit of gratitude and joy in this place? You cannot get to that gratitude place until you're heard. You cannot put silver linings around stuff unless you feel heard. And we often try to do that. We often try to be like, okay, but here's the positives. We all got to do spend more time with our kids. I can't get there unless we get to this place of this has been so incredibly hard. What am I to be grateful for in this moment right now? What has went well in this process? What do I have for my kids? What do I have for my family? What have I done well out of this? I've homeschooled for the last 3 months and the children still know how to read. Where do I get to this place of gratitude? And when we get yes buts, that means we haven't heard. That means we haven't listened enough. Right? And I say this in therapy all the time. And they say, yes, but we've already tried that. Nope, that's not going to work. Yes, but what about? Tell me more. And you know when I ask that question the most? When I don't want to know more. And I often don't want to know more because I just know I want to just tell you what I need to do. It doesn't really work for me as a psychologist. So when I ask that question all the time about tell me more, it's often when we need to hear it the most, right? And I hear you saying we're listening a lot. I think that's really critically important. Then what? And how do we keep going? Not back just to the seats at the table, but the voices, right? It's that process of when we don't know where we're headed in terms of restrictions and guidelines and all of those things. It's that constant process. It's not an end game. How do we keep saying, right? Does that make sense?
Yep, it sure does. And so I guess for parents or for caregivers, for parents, so we now have the economy relaunching. I mean, for me, 2 weeks ago, we were biking and my son said, "Hey, Mom, the playground is open." And my husband said, let's go. And I wasn't necessarily ready for that yet. I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know. Do I have hand sanitizer? And so instead I said, well, I think it's full over there, but we'll come back tomorrow, because I had to think about that. So what advice do you have for parents as we get into this, but also, our caregivers, foster kinship care? I mean, we have been in a different situation where, as you mentioned earlier, some of those in-person, face-to-face meetings with families haven't been happening in person, and now we are shifting. And I've got to thank our frontline social workers in the Ministry of Children's Services for adapting and finding ways to keep kids connected to their families, and to addressing all of our processes and giving excellent feedback for ministry leadership to really pivot and adapt and meet the needs of parents and families while still keeping especially vulnerable kids or families safe. What are some advice or pieces of advice? I know we are already 15 minutes over, which thank you for your time. But what would you leave for parents out there or caregivers who are, we're kind of coming out of that kind of difficult last 3 months and starting to look forward, positive optimism, things are opening back up. What are some advice or pieces of advice that you have as we move through this?
I think what's really critical is probably these 5 things that we sort of touched on a little bit. Is I want to make sure that there's somewhere to put all of the stuff that you've held on your shoulders for the last 3-4 months, right? Financial weight, concerns about not being there for your kids, not being able to spend time with them, not being able to hug them or see them. I mean, that's what some parents, foster parents, have faced. And I think the magnitude of that is massive, right? And, we had this conversation even yesterday about just how there has been so much emotion in this place. If we don't provide some space for it and recognize that then this is where it ends up in the body, then how do we just sort of drop our shoulders and then head into this place of, okay, what about this? Did I do well? What about this? Where is this place? And I say this quite often, that joy is a choice. And I've said this to people who have buried their own babies, people who are stage 4, people who are struggling so significantly, right? It becomes really critically important that we will look for everything that is not going well, because that is how we've been conditioned to look at things. We, even in our generation, but certainly previous generations, have always been, you don't look for the positives, right? You got to prepare for all the stuff that's going to go wrong, right? I mean, I often say this growing up in a farming community, right? Like, I rarely heard a farmer say, like, you know what, it's going to be good, Ethel. It's going to be really good this year. There's often like, it's going to be too wet. It's going to be too dry. It's going to be, And we come from, historically, multiple generations ago, being able to we have to prepare for the worst. We have to wait. Who's going to come over this hill and get us? Who's going to do that? Here's the issue. You can't hold 2 emotions in your head at one time. You can have mixed emotions, but one will always win. And when you're busy planning for all the bad stuff, what you miss is what you're doing well. What you've done beautifully with your children, what you've done beautifully with your staff, what you've done beautifully with your daycare centers, what has happened it becomes a choice. It's not that we disregard all the things that we need to still work on and fix and hold and pay attention to. Those will never, ever go away. Those become historically really critical, particularly with our vulnerable populations, the cultures who need our attention, the babies, the families, the kids, regardless. That becomes so critically important. Yeah. How do we hold space and be and find that place of joy and gratitude? They deserve it. You know,